Welcome to an adventure through inner space. Through Monsanto's mighty microscope, you will journey into the incredible universe found within a tiny fragment of a snowflake. I am the first person to make this fabulous journey. Suspended in the timelessness of inner space are the thought waves of my first impressions. They will be our only source of contact once you pass beyond the limits of normal magnification. How is it that this tiny bit of crystal towers above me like an enormous wall of solid ice? Indeed, I am becoming smaller and smaller. I see now that it is the orbiting electrons that give the atom its fuzzy appearance. And still I continue to shrink until I am able to pierce the wall of this oxygen atom. Electrons are dashing above me like so many fiery comets. Can I possibly survive? I am so infinitely small now that the orbiting electrons of this tiny speck of snowflake crystal appear like the Milky Way of our own familiar world. And there is the nucleus. Do I dare enter the unknown vastness of its inner space? No, it is better that I return to the realm of the molecule before I am tempted to go on shrinking forever. The molecules are so active now. That can only mean that the snowflake is beginning to melt.
Walt Disney's park Disneyland was always in a state of constant change ever since the park opened. By late 1959, the first major expansion had taken place with Matterhorn Mountain, the submarine voyage, and the all-new Bob Gurr-designed monorail system, opening to rave reviews and proving that the Disneyland success story was here to stay. With Sputnik spinning over our fragile globe and the US-Soviet space race in high gear, Disneyland's throngs of guests made Tomorrowland one of the most crowded sections of Walt's Magic Kingdom. Unfortunately, Tomorrowland was little more than an afterthought when it opened a few years before.
Here was an area that was not even broken ground on until 6 months before the park opening. It was thought, in fact, of not opening Tomorrowland at all until months later, but Walt thought that would be cheating the audience. He'd been telling them all about it for a year. He couldn't say, well, it's not ready, come back next year. So he decided, no, we have to open Tomorrowland, even though it's going to have a lot of plywood walls and we'll put some plants in front of things that aren't done. We have to have some kind of Tomorrowland. So hurriedly, furiously, they went to recruit as many sponsors as they could to staff and help design what would go into the opening day Tomorrowland.
Ever since the invention of the bow and arrow, mankind has both worried and been fascinated by the forward march of science. Today, with the recent discovery of tremendous natural forces and their harnessing to man's use, man is still anxious, yet still hopeful.
Science fiction was huge at the time, as well as the idea that Disneyland should both entertain and teach young people to be ready for the challenge of what tomorrow would bring. Scientific experimentation was at the center of the new attraction to be called Adventures in Science. Early conceptual drawings in Disneyland guidebooks showed a large viewing area where guests would observe futuristic scientific events. The entrance to this attraction was through a giant microscope, riding what looked like some sort of germ or protozoa. Due to the attention directed toward the 1964 World's Fair, this major attraction was never built. For in 1961, The flying saucers soon landed on the real estate in which Adventures in Science was to have occupied.
One of the most interesting additions to Tomorrowland was the flying saucer ride. That ride was there just long enough for a lot of people to ride it, and then when they went back to Disneyland, it wasn't there anymore. The flying saucer still today has more people asking whatever happened to the flying saucers. Sometimes people don't even believe they were ever there. It broke everybody's heart to see the thing go, because it was, I thought, the best ride from the standpoint that you had to ride it several times before you figured out how to make it work well. And you'd watch for a long time, and then when your turn came to get in the car, you figured, oh, I know how to make it run now. And after a while, you could get really, really good, and you knew where to get in the car so that when the ride came to an end, the boom gave you the most room to play before the boom locked you off into the unload area again. But I personally loved driving it because I could go out and smash and bash other people really hard with it because I knew how it worked. Yeah, if you were a little bit above the weight target, it didn't lift off enough to get enough thrust out of the skirt, say like out the back to move forward, because the front end of the skirt would dig in. And if you were really, really light, the thing would go into the resonance bounce and trigger a shutdown. The little kids were having a terrible time, and the fatties sat there.
By 1965, however, Tomorrowland was an aging relic that looked more like present-day scientific advancement land than a vision from futuristic 1986. In fact, attractions like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea were an example of how Disney had to fill space when it opened Tomorrowland, and how they were still promoting a film that was released over a decade prior. Something had to be done. Walt Disney had become friends with the Monsanto Chemical Company chairman, Dr. Charles Allen, when the two worked together on the Monsanto-sponsored attraction called the Hall of Chemistry. The Hall of Chemistry at Disneyland gave many their first look at what a large part atoms and molecules play in the makeup of all living things. With plans for a 1967 opening of an all-new Tomorrowland to replace the current Todayland syndrome, Walt once again called upon his Imagineers to come up with an all-new innovative attraction Monsanto would sponsor. Borrowing from the Adventures in Science concept, Imagineers Claude Coates and Exitencio came up with what would be called Adventure Through Innerspace.
It was an attraction, a themed attraction, almost like a science lab. It looked like almost an experiment of a machine that would shrink people, and you would experience different stages of molecules, and eventually reaching an atom of a giant snowflake particle.
Adventure Through Innerspace would be Tomorrowland's showcase of the great discoveries made by the scientists at Monsanto every day. The queue area for this adventure looked like a gigantic scientific experiment, with the guests as its test subjects. Imagineer George McGinnis designed the enormous futuristic microscope for this attraction.
Herb Ryman had done the painting of the queue, and he had a kind of a horizontal microscope, brass, traditional brass microscope, and you looked through portholes and saw the smaller vehicles. Well, I didn't like the look of this old microscope. I sketched at lunchtime in the cafeteria. I was always sketching on napkins. So I designed the mighty microscope with the clear front where you saw the vehicles reduced. I was sketching the mighty microscope, and it must have been a pretty good sketch. Exitencio liked it and he took it to the model shop, and what they built was from that napkin sketch. So the model in the small scale model was from that sketch. I did detailed drawings of it later. I wanted to make it faster reading what the story was, and I didn't think the portholes walking along and looking at portholes that shrunken cars said it. So it was just a design that came to mind out of not only the brass, getting rid of the brass, but a modern shape that it didn't look like a microscope, but it looked like a high-tech machine that would do the job. It got shortened because of the space, but I had a little longer front on it. Yeah, it worked very well for the under 12.
The mighty microscope was adventure through Innerspace's main draw.
It almost looked like a sci-fi set from something from a movie, seeing a science lab kind of a thing with seeing people shrink and the illusion. I mean, when I was little, I really thought those people were shrinking in that tube. That was one of my favorite parts. I remember actually when I'd get on the ride, I was bummed that I wasn't going to be able to see that anymore, and I had to go back and check it out again.
Guests in line would hear strange calculations being made.
That read right away when you walked into the queue. People have told me that frightened them when they saw that shrunk.
Other guests boarded round ride vehicles, and then, almost seeming to shrink right before their eyes, they entered a world where snowflakes towered over even the largest skyscrapers.
What I did, I had them upright on the top of a loop, and then they came back through the beamway, hidden. It was a continuous loop of cars, but it looked very realistic. And Jack Gladish built those. He built the motion belt.
When you walked into the lobby, you just see a machine with chairs going inside it, and in a tube of the microscope, you'd see smaller chairs to give the illusion of shrinking. So when you would actually ride in the chair, you'd go inside the machine and end up going through different rooms that had various sets.
A dynamic ride system using a continuous chain of vehicles was pioneered by Disney legend Bob Gurr.
After we did the 4 shows at the New York World's Fair, the company wanted to look at different kinds of ride systems, and there was a couple of ride systems that were developed at the World's Fair that I thought had some really nice features. One of them was a General Motors ride, which was like a continuous, endless chain of just platforms and chairs. And there was a system of, I think AT&T had another very interesting one that was a continuous chain. And I thought, boy, there's a big advantage in a continuous chain of vehicles, because you totally eliminate ride respacing, you totally eliminate individual control, and you get rid of all collision if you do endless chain. But what was missing was the idea of different viewpoints of the guest. Where could the guest viewpoint be directed in the design of a show? And our show designers were always looking for what could we do different that would make a show entirely different. And one day I was sitting in John Hench's office, and we were discussing ideas to kick around. And he had a candied apple on a stick on his desk. And sort of in a matter of seconds, I was talking to John, and I said, well, you know, if we do an endless chain, we can go up and down really, really steep hills, and we could probably turn fairly tight. And then I thought, if we go up and down steep hills, we have to tip the car body. And then it was like, eureka! I grabbed the apple and I held it up and I twirled it in my fingers, and I said, if the chassis goes up and down at an angle, we could have a control track that would hold the bodies right side up for both going uphill and downhill. And if we did that, we could add the ability to turn them right to left. And this meant that you could have the ability to look in all directions. And within the minute or so, I called it Omnimover, which was a derivation of mover from people mover. And because I'm a pilot, and one of the key navigational aids that are used in aviation is called an omni range, which means omni, which means all or all around, all encompassing. And I thought, oh, all encompassing viewpoint mover, omni mover. And that's the whole thing from the first part of the idea to the end of the idea. I don't think took more than 2 minutes.
The Omni Mover was a new ride system, and Walt said, "I want this to be as smooth as can be. Put a martini glass on it, and it won't spill a drop." Well, it never worked quite that nice. It was it worked pretty good, but your focal plate, you move from this point to this point, it wasn't real smooth. It kind of jerk over here and jerk that way. So they never could get that worked out to it. It was really, really smooth.
This system was revolutionary because unlike dark rides, such as Snow White and Mr. Toad, the audience's view was dictated by the direction in which the vehicle would put them. This system was used in many other popular rides, such as the Haunted Mansion and If You Had Wings in Florida, among many others. With ride system and sponsor in place, it was up to Imagineer ex Atencio to write a narration script that would be both scientifically accurate and yet able to be understood by the wide variety of Disneyland guests.
I went back to Monsanto, to their headquarters in St. Louis, and to get some background, some information about Innerspace. And I talking to these eggheads and these PhDs, and I said, now I gotta do this at my level. I didn't even take chemistry in high school, so I can't be talking above people's heads. So they went over my script, etc. And then the CEO came out from St. Louis, looked at our storyboards, and he said, the only thing I'd want to be sure is that whatever we do is authentic. We don't want to put too much showbiz in it. It's got to be true to what happens to a molecule, etc. And I says, all right, let's do that.
But a great story of shrinking scientists exploring the vastness of inner space and a breathtaking ride vehicle system cleverly called Atomobiles were only half of this ride's appeal. A song was needed, a song that would tell of the wonders that could be brought to mankind by molecules and the Monsanto Company. Richard and Robert Sherman, the famous Disney songwriting team responsible for the music of the Carousel of Progress, Mary Poppins, and It's a Small World, among others, were given the assignment of creating a catchy corporate song for Monsanto.
I remember it was fascinating, it was highly scientific, very exciting, and it's sort of a concept of shrinking people into seeing these gigantic elements that actually are minuscule. It was wonderful. I mean, so brazen, so completely astounding. And then we had to write something about the molecular structure. Bob and I had these crazy assignments. We'd always say, yeah, okay, we'll do that, right? And then we'd find out what to do. We didn't know what to do, but we'd sort of wing it and make it happen.
The song they would write would be Miracle from Molecules, heard at the conclusion of the attraction in a pseudo Hall of Chemistry / Monsanto futuristic product display.
Miracles from molecules around us everywhere. There are miracles from molecules in the earth, the sea, the air. Now men with dreams are furthering what nature first began, making modern miracles from molecules for man.
Miracles from Molecules, I remember vividly. We worked very hard to make that song make sense. That was like the culmination after you went through this enormous ride, brilliantly narrated by Paul Frees. I remember he was the voice.
I am the first person to make this fabulous journey. Suspended in the timelessness of inner space are the thought waves of my first impressions. They will be our only source of contact once you have passed beyond the limits of normal magnification.
The narration in the ride was something you'd almost never forget. Paul Frees is just such an amazing voice actor, and once you hear him, you'll never forget him. I mean, you hear him in the Haunted Mansion, and you hear him in so many attractions at Disneyland.
Paul was always my man. I loved to work with Paul. He was such a genius, and my first experience was on a cartoon that we had done. He was Von Drake, and Ludwig von Drake.
And we'd done a lot of things with Freeze because he was Ludwig von Drake. He was the mad Ludwig.
Nice thing about Paul and my association with him, Paul would come in for a recording session, and you spent the first half hour of the recording session listening to Paul tell how great he is. And then we'd finally say, okay, let's get to work, Paul. And I'd give him the script, and he would just run with it. Just one take, and he had it. But he got himself into the character, and if it was a pirate, it was a pirate. If it was a ghost, it was a ghost. But he would come up with stuff that I wouldn't dream of writing. I couldn't, and so I wasn't ego enough to say, well, no, I wanted it just the way I wrote it. So he'd come up and he'd plus it, and he really did a good job of it.
When you ride Adventure Through Inner Space, his ominous voice is just it almost gives you the chills when you're listening to him. I don't really know how to explain it, but he's just a great voice actor, and he's done so much great work out there too that you always recognize him after that too. You hear him in a cartoon character, and you go, "Oh, that's Paul Frees," you know.
But I remember distinctly on the ride hearing, "And still I continue to shrink." That was the main memory I had of Innerspace.
And still I continue to shrink. What compelling force draws me into this mysterious darkness? Can this be the threshold of inner space?
But he could do anything. And that was X's script, I believe. So, yeah, we've done a lot of things together. But when you worked at Disney, it was always like the team. You just never thought, hey, this is so-and-so's thing. It was just, okay, we're part of it. We'll do our hunk and leave it at that, you know.
As guests entered the attraction building, there was a great feeling of not having to give up one of their precious ride tickets. For Adventure Through Inner Space was completely free, thanks to the sponsorship of Monsanto.
It was kind of special to people that rode it when they were a child, I think, and they always kind of like to go back to it once in a while. It was a free ride in the park, and it didn't have a ticket. I think later on they made it a ticket attraction, but it was a free ticket to go on it.
As guests winded down the curved acrylic carpeted pathways, the mighty microscope came into view, and a giant snowflake illuminated this eerie scientific environment. Even the attendants seemed odd, wearing costumes made from the futuristic material polyester, a product made by the Monsanto company. Imagineer Claude Coates came up with much of the interior layout and designs for Inner Space.
Claude and I were always on projects together.
Actually, Claude Coates did the layout. Claude was excellent at getting the most ride in the space, and Claude did an awful lot of that.
Obviously, Walt would mate with Ex Atencio, Yale Gracie, and others that were working. I was just an industrial designer that did the microscope and some of the signs, some of the post-show. I wasn't involved at all with story. Well, a microscope was a big part of the story.
The ride itself began as you entered your Atommobile and were then shrunk down to the level of the atom by the mysterious, mighty microscope.
You'd see walls of ice representing that you're seeing one snowflake and getting smaller, and then you'd enter through that to see molecules, and the molecules would be projected on the walls, and other various special effects were used to give the illusion, you know, like with mirrors to give an illusion of infinity with molecules. And eventually at the conclusion you'd reach the nucleus that would blink, and eventually you'd come back out and you'd see a microscope looking down at you from the scientists that were doing this experiment and watching its riders going by, and you see a giant eye looking at you and you're looking up into this microscope, which was pretty exciting as a child to see something like that, you know. You'd only see something like that in the movies, and actually experiencing that as a kid was pretty neat.
My kids thought that was my eye. I guess it was blue. Anyway, Yale Gracie gets a lot of credit for that, the special effects in there. He was a one-man special effects department.
Unlike traditional dark rides, Adventure Through Inner Space didn't have a lot of physical sets. Like if you went on Snow White or Peter Pan or anything like that, there's actual physical built sets. Some of them are flats, like in the Alice in Wonderland attraction. And then there's, of course, Pirates, where there's just tons of animatronics and big boats and water and caves and all kinds of stuff. Adventure Through Inner Space was not like that. You board the Atomobile through the microscope, so you see the area, you see that things are getting smaller, there's some kind of experiment going on here, and you're going to be a part of it, which is kind of weird, but kind of cool. So as a little guinea pig, you get on here, you go through the microscope, and then it's black. And black is a great way to just scare the audience a little bit, kind of get them in the mood, get their attention. When things go black, you pay attention.
We got all sorts of rumors that people were fainting and things like that on the ride, and but no, they were just rumors.
I've heard that people that got it right away when they were frightened by the thought they were going to be shrunk.
We found that the illusions we had were kind of tampered with by the audience, the young kids, that if they could reach out to touch something, why they do it. So we just had to live with that.
A lot of people scream, like Exitencio says, and a lot of the kids would scream. I remember knocking on the Atomobile in front of me. That was, my friend would get in one, I'd get in the other, we'd knock on them together. But still you'd get in that mood and you'd hear the narration come on, here's where you would begin your adventure.
Now your adventure through inner space has begun. Through the mighty microscope, you will travel into the incredible universe found within a tiny fragment of a snowflake.
It was complete blackness. I mean, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face when you first entered that microscope. And your chair would shake and you'd make a turn in, you weren't really going through the microscope, of course, you'd make that left turn into the sets.
And you'd go inside into the black. Then there were some walls of ice that were kind of glitter and kind of these set pieces. And then there was just projections for most of the ride. There was black, and then there was projections. And there wasn't a lot of physical set pieces like a ride like Pirates or Small World or any of the other dark rides. It was mainly, Claude Coates was a big fan of projections and projectors in general. And on Inner Space there was just projectors. You wouldn't hear them because there was music and there was a narration, and especially that you were inside the Atomobile, so you'd have the speakers right near you, which was a nice effect, and there was piped-in music other places. But then there was the nucleus, which was just kind of a ball attached to the wall. And then the eye. When you'd look up, you'd see the eye looking down at you as you passed by. And that was really all for set pieces. So Adventure Through Inner Space was a very simple ride, but it made you think, what if you really were getting small? What was it like to go down to the atom, the smallest building block of matter? All these types of things. And you always, whenever you hear Exitencio's scripts, I always think, I'm a little bit smarter because, such as in the Haunted Mansion, he's got the Requiem bell, and Adventure Through Inner Space, you're going to the smallest building block of matter. I mean, you feel like you learn something when you get off these attractions.
You can explore the fascinating molecular world in a snowflake and witness the incredible energy inside an atom.